Good morning. My name is Shakisha Webb Scott. I am a board member for the Coalition of Public Independent Charter Schools and the founder and CEO of Impact Charter School, based in Baker, Louisiana. We are honored today to be joined by Chris Stewart, a lifelong activist with a long history supporting education related issues. Chris is based in the Minneapolis area and currently serves as the CEO of Brightbeam, a nonprofit network of education activists who demand a better education and brighter future for every child. Chris currently serves as the board chair of Students for Education's Reforms Action Network. Chris has served as the Director of Outreach and External Affairs for Education Post and as the Executive Director of the African American Leadership Forum. He has also served as an elected member of the Minneapolis Public Schools Board of Education. Chris brings light to systemic inequalities and challenges them in his work. He is a voice on the Eight Black Hands podcast, a podcast from four Black men who are passionate about educating Black minds. With a following of 12.5 thousand, Chris blogs and tweets on these issues under the name Citizen Stewart. Chris will speak about the role of independent charter schools supporting students in a pandemic that has completely uprooted their lives. We would like to thank Highmark for sponsoring this keynote and making it possible. Let's welcome Chris.
Wow. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm grateful and humbled by the invitation to be with you all today. At the start, I like to start where I think things are most important, and that's with kids. And more important than kids, with babies. So every day there are 360,000 new babies that are born. That's 360,000 new lives, new souls. And they exist today and they didn't exist yesterday. And tomorrow there will be a new bumper crop of that many babies. I personally believe that each of those kids is a story. Each of those kids, each of those babies, they are a life that was brought to us to unfold slowly before us. And that story is one in which God is the author. In each one of those babies, it's my belief also that God has invested in unsurpassable worth that can't be taken away from them, no matter how hard we try. And I think it's because, in my estimate, our arms are too short to box with God. So that brings me to what I think is a level setting question that should be asked at every education conference, every education meeting. Is just the most basic possible question, which is, how are the children? And the way that you answer that question is very important. When we say, how are the children, we are setting the debate. We're setting the table. We're centralizing what is most important. I just want to point out that this isn't my question. This is an old question. This is one that comes from the Maasai tribe of southern Kenya. And it's often been appropriated as a rhetorical device in speeches and in meetings, basically because in that culture, what they mean by the question is, how is your society? How is your civilization? There's only one answer. There's only one right answer to how are the children. And that answer for the Maasai is, the children are well. And if you say that the children are well, that means that the adults are doing what they're supposed to be doing. If the answer is the children are not well, that is an indictment on all of the adults in that civilization. Because children to them are the sine qua non. And the sine qua non is that thing of which, without it, nothing else can exist. And I believe that about our children. I believe that within our children and in the intellectual development of our children, within their minds and their brains, their bodies, their souls, their hearts, within them rest all of the promise, all of the potential that we have for our civilization. And what we do to them is the biggest marker of who we are and who we want to be as a society. Unfortunately, we don't always live up to that. But when you think about your schools, when you think about your systems, when you think about the work that you're trying to accomplish in this life, if the kids aren't doing well in your system, you have to really stop and think, your theology is wrong. Your beliefs are wrong. Your politics are wrong. Your pedagogy are wrong. Everything that you hold true in this world is wrong if the children aren't doing well. So I'd like to just do an exercise. Have you imagine with me just a scenario. Okay, so in this scenario, you are a couple or a family of any structure, and you move to a new city. And in your big move, you've taken care of the big things. You've taken care of the housing, you've taken care of employment, you got a new job, you've changed banks, you've done all the things on your task list. The one thing that fell off your task list is that you didn't make a decision for what school your kids would attend, either school or schools that they would attend. And maybe it's not that you actually didn't want to make the decision. Maybe it's just that you looked casually at a few options and figured out, I'm not going to be able to decide from a distance. So when I get there, I'll figure it out. And just as you're sitting there starting to realize, oh, okay, so, it's getting closer to the end of summer and maybe we need to make this decision, there's a knock at the door. And that knock at the door is a public employee. And that public employee has shown up to be your own personal educational concierge. And after sharing a lot of information about your children, talking about their temperament, thinking about their cultural heritage, thinking through all the things that you think through that would be important to you in choosing a school, your ancestors, your values, all the things that are important to you. Just like magic, the concierge pulls up a couple of websites, you fill out a whole bunch of information in a few forms, and a couple of clicks later, presto, your kids are not just enrolled in schools, they're enrolled in great schools, schools that are matched to them, ones that fit everything that you put in to that website. It matches them, the culture that you want from them. It matches the type of language that you want spoken. It matches everything for you. Presto, just like magic. Okay, so now that's a great scenario, but let's wake up, because I know, we all know that reality is much different than that scenario. That situation doesn't really exist. We don't really have a personal concierge. We don't really have a magic website that we could punch in all the most important information about our specific kids that will spit out an option for us that is personalized and tailored specifically to our family's needs and our child's needs. And we definitely don't have a system where once you find that school that you could just press a button and boom, voila, your kid is enrolled. But man, wouldn't it be lovely if that was the situation that we were in with our kids? I don't think that it's any time. I don't think that we're close to getting there. I don't think that situation is coming. But I do think that within you all, the work that you do as a coalition, as educators, as visionaries, and as creative people who don't think big, but think small enough to be realistic, think at the grassroots, think at the site level, think at the level of which the real magic happens between teachers and the students that they teach. I do believe that there's a lot of opportunity there. And I believe that you are the group that could, over the years and over time, rescue us from all the wrong questions in education and get us back to the idea that schools are for kids. And they're not just for kids in general or writ large, but they're for your specific child. That child has an inalienable right to not just an education, but an education that is fitting to them. That is a humane education. And that is what your coalition and the work that you all do can help deliver to us in the United States. So there's this common critique of charter schools that we have to always address. And that critique is that charter schools aren't really living up to their original premise. They're not living up to their original promise. They're not living up to what they were originally intended and meant to do. Now, for some, they will tell you that original premise was to be laboratories for educators, so that educators could try new things, and that those new things that they would try would become new methods of teaching that eventually would make their way back into the regular traditional public education system. All right. I could argue a little bit with, I don't know that that's the original premise, but it is true that is one of the things that may not be happening in charter schools right now. And we can talk about others. But the power of this critique, to me, even if it's off target, is that it raises a bigger question in what is the real root of charter schools? And I think about that question in two ways. The first way is, what is the root of chartering as a process? Where did it come from? What was the spirit of education that led us to chartering as an enterprise? But also it raises the question for me about what does it mean to have roots, period, to be a rooted school, to be rooted in community, rooted in heritage, rooted in ancestry, rooted and relevant to the people that you serve. So today I want to talk a little bit about that. Today I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about charters and the rootedness of charters and chartering as a process. I want to talk about creating schools now and into the future that are rooted. So I'd call those rooted schools. And I want to talk about the homeschool relationship, because I think that is, for me, that's one of the most important things that we can ever discuss, is how parents and educators and students are creating that, often talked about three-legged stool of education, working together and pulling and rowing the same direction for the same goals. So first, in thinking about the discussion with you all today, I did think about which Chris Stewart should show up. So I've been a parent since 1990. So I certainly can talk to you as a parent. And in 1990, when I became a parent, I was a much different parent than I am today, 3 decades later, almost 3 decades later. So I could talk to you as a parent who has been consistently a public school parent over those years, mostly consistently a public school parent over all those years, which means I've done first grade multiple times. I've done kindergarten. I've done the first day of school. I've done spring break multiple times over year after year after year after year for decades. I could talk to you about a digital activist, somebody who spends most of my days thinking about ways to change the narrative, to goose the people who are getting the narrative wrong, to push them where they are wrong, and to change the narrative so that we get a more positive, inclusive narrative that helps us answer the right questions in education and get out of the education debate that is useless, circular, that's senseless, that has us really not solving the problems for kids. I also could speak to you as somebody who was a school board member. And boy, was that in education. Being a school board member of an urban school board gave me insights into how much of education and the educational enterprise isn't really about children, how much of it is about business and the needs of adults, and how much of it is about parochial behavior and turfism and boundaries, and more about buildings and books and contracts and all of these things at the expense of really truly being about the question, how are the children? It's possible to be a school board member and lord over a district for years, possibly even decades, with schools that are turning out every year a bumper crop of kids that aren't getting what they need. They're not being raised to their highest potential. They're not leaving these schools or these school districts prepared for a world that is ruthless, a ruthless economy. If you have no skills in the United States, that is probably the highest stakes test that you can't fail, is to be a person in the United States who leaves 12 years of education in an education system with only 6 years of education. Something that one of our great civil rights icons called the biggest violence. The biggest violence is leaving after 12 years in a system with only 6 years of education. I could also speak to you as the CEO of Brightbeam, the leader of a team and a network of parents and students, educators, people who raise their voice and use their voice to put pressure on decision makers to be responsible for the children in their jurisdictions, put pressure on decision makers to make good decisions, not on behalf of adults or public employees or people in the system or middle-class college-educated people who are already doing well for themselves, so well that they have gotten jobs in these systems, but for the kids, for the families, for the people that are living on the wrong side of a belief gap, for the people that are living at the wrong end, the business end of a wealth gap, for the people in the shadows of all of our wealth, the children, the faces at the bottom of the well, the people that Jonathan Kozol said were living in savage inequalities. He said that decades ago. He could have said it yesterday, and it would still be true. I want to say to you that I'm a person who recognizes patterns. I'm a pattern recognition person. So let me talk a little bit about a pattern that I've seen that bears lifting up to you all today, because I want to say this everywhere I go and everywhere I speak. I go to a lot of cities. I've traveled a lot of places. And in those places I go, I speak to parents, I speak to students, I speak to educators. I visit a lot of schools, a lot of different kinds of schools that are doing different kinds of things for different kinds of kids. In my travels, I do ask this question that I would ask you all. Hey, I'm here in Milwaukee, or I'm here in Austin, or I'm here in Atlanta. Tell me, how are the children? And when I ask that question in any city, I get a range of answers. Some of the answer is many of our kids are doing well. Many of our kids are making gains. They're progressing academically. Others are struggling, but we're getting them the supports that they need. And even though they have been struggling and middling in the middle, we've been able to push them forward and to push them up. Some of the other kids that we will talk about are living in very, very deeply traumatic situations. They're suffering from a lot of adverse childhood experiences. They're, in many cases, afraid to even walk to school because they're not in safe neighborhoods. Their built environment is actually one that is dangerous just to exist in. And in many cases, in one of the wealthiest nations in the world, those kids are living in homes that are food insecure. Savage, savage, savage inequalities. Now, all those assessments would be true of most any place that I go, most any city that I go to. But here's the pattern that I said that I recognize in each of those places. First of all, most of the places that I go to are big cities. I live in a small town. I live in a small, more rural area, but the places that I travel to are very different than where I live. These places where I travel to have progressive governments, progressive municipal governments from top to bottom, from the mayor down to the lowest elected or appointed position in the city. Everybody's progressive. And in these cities, what you will see is a lot of wealth that's being built. You will see cranes and buildings and condos and new restaurants. You will see neighborhoods that used to be blighted neighborhoods turned around, and all of a sudden they are too expensive to live in for people that have lived in those neighborhoods for generations. You will see that there is glitz and there is wealth. And as I'm talking, you probably know some of these places. Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, Austin, very much in my own backyard, the Twin Cities. They have booming economies. They are places that are building this immense, immense group of very fortunate people who have fortunes by world standards. There's a new upscale lifestyle in all of these places. Yoga studios, which I always give every city a hard time for. You know that a city is changing when you get the bike lanes, the coffee shop, the yoga studio, the wine bars, the wine-infused coffee shops. These are cities of fabulous wealth with big populations of college-educated people and progressive elected officials from top to bottom. And at the same time, there's a through line through all of them and a moral cord that runs through all of them and connects them to one very cold reality. And that is this: in the shadows of all of that wealth and all of that prosperity, living at the margins, are children who will never grow up to enjoy the prosperity and the economic boom of the cities that they're born in. These are what Derek Bell called the faces, the famous faces in my case, at the bottom of the well. They've been redlined, they've been sequestered, they have been ghettoized into conditions that none of us want for our own kids. But the sad reality is that many of them aren't going to cross over from the opportunity deserts that they live into, and that we make real decisions to put them into the economic, the social, and the political mainstream, where they could really enjoy the fruits of a first world country. So shame on those cities. Shame on all of them. Shame on us if we do nothing to help. Shame on us if we can't be counted among those who show up with an idea, with a program, with a pitch, with a proposal, with an effort, with anything that frees the kids from those really, really immoral situations that we have put them into. To me, education is a great place to start. I really do believe that education makes a difference. And I really do think that schools and educators make a difference. They can change the trajectory of the lives of kids. Now, I know that many people believe and will say that education really isn't that powerful and that it's not that linked to social mobility. In some cases, they might even say that, like, money is not really the answer, that many things within those children and their families, their cultures or whatnot, are the driver of their problem. One of my mentors, Dr. Howard Fuller, likes to say that the only people who think that money doesn't matter are the people who have money. The only people who think that choices and options don't matter are the people who already have choices and options themselves. So here's the assumption that I make. I look across the country and I see that there's almost no place where more than a third of Black fourth graders are reading on grade level. Now, when I think about that number, I think that number is not just a number. It's not just a statistic on a page. It's not just something that we say for effect. That's a prophecy. When you say that 2/3 of any population at fourth grade aren't reading on grade level, scientifically speaking, you can make many, many, many predictions about what happens for them or to them after fourth grade. You can predict whether or not they're going to be ready for algebra, for instance, in the 8th grade. You can predict on what they're going to be ready to do in terms of coursework in high school. You can predict how many of them are going to drop out of school altogether, or graduate not ready to go to college or to do anything meaningful in the economy that helps them live a self-determined life. 2/3 of any population that can't read on grade level is not just a statistic, it's a catastrophe. In some states, it's even worse than that. In some states, we're talking 17%, 19%, maybe 11% of Black fourth graders who are not reading. Now, I don't think it's because these children were born without elastic brains. I don't think that their circumstances have made them so ill-equipped to learn that we can't expect education for teachers, for schools to make a difference in their lives, for them to be able to reach the very minimal bar of what we call proficiency. I don't believe that. What I believe is that the system has been rigged. And before we get to blaming students and before we get to blaming their parents, we need to take a deep look in the mirror. The system is rigged in some very important ways that I think are fixable, but we haven't fixed them. The way that we fund schools and deploy resources is inequitable. We have schools that are wealthier that get more money, and we have schools that are poorer and get less money. And in some districts within the same district, we have some situations where poor kids are actually subsidizing the programs in schools that are wealthier than they are. The way that we train and recruit and hire teachers and monitor them and evaluate them, it's also inequitable. We know for a fact that many of our kids that need the most and need the best instruction are sitting in classrooms with the teachers that are the least equipped and supported to give it to them. The way that children end up in classrooms is really important to look at. We track kids who are already behind or already in need of much more attention into classrooms where there are lower expectations, sometimes into entire schools. We have offloaded students through tracking into circumstances that don't raise them up and give them more hope and opportunity, but rob them once again of the critical thing that they need, which is great instruction from caring, well-prepared, well-informed educators. The way that we do all of these things for that 360,000 kids differentiates them. We split those kids into categories, and some of those categories are going to do better than others. That's immoral to me, and that's a shame. And we need to get out of that. Now, let me say this. None of this is because we've had a lack of trying. There have been education reformers for years promising that they had the answer. and bringing new answers to bear, bringing new answers to the market. Those answers haven't always in the long run worked out for us well. Take magnet schools, for instance. Magnet schools once were the answer, desegregation and magnet schools. If you look at a place like Kansas City today, you have to ask yourself, what's the history here? What happened? And in Kansas City, billions of dollars were spent on magnet schools, building these beautiful Taj Mahals with swimming pools and racket clubs, tennis courts, beautiful schools meant to attract people from the suburbs to go to school with urban students. A great plan. It was aimed in the right place. It was something that we should all agree is important to try and bring people together. But that big, expensive idea actually has had mixed results. If you look at Kansas City today, one of the places where the biggest kind of investment was made in that, today students are struggling in that city, in those same big, beautiful schools that were built for others. The people that they were built to attract have left. The kids have been left behind, and today they are still not getting an education. They definitely are not in the place that reformers said that they would be. But let's not be, as charter school supporters, let's not be too glib about that or too smug about that, because if you look at New Orleans is the Kansas City of magnet schools, except for those schools are charter schools. And in New Orleans, as somebody who went to New Orleans public schools, as somebody who understands a little bit about what education in New Orleans was before Katrina, I can tell you that it also is a mixed blessing. You have better schools than you had before, definitely have better facilities, more investments in kids, stronger teachers in many cases. You also still have a large number of schools that are rated D and F and haven't lived up to the promise that reformers made. So what's missing? What's missing from the thousands of magnet schools that we built, the thousands of charter schools that we built, the thousand of secret contract alternative schools that we have contracted to offload students into as a place to put students that we know for a fact that the regular system can't educate? All of these things that have been tried, that haven't really worked, what is behind it? So this goes to a point that I want to make around the root. What is the root of these schools? What is the root of a magnet school or a charter school? And this is the way that I look at it. Very simple composition. This is basic to me. The root of education is culture. Culture is the root of education, and parents are the stem and students are the leaves. And if you mess up any of that plant, your school will fail. If your school is not rooted in something relevant to parents and students and beyond their lives of test scores, but in their lives as people, as a people with a history and a legacy and a heritage, then I believe that you are setting yourself up for failure. You are building a school on sand, and you will shift and you will be wiped away, or you will be New Orleans or Kansas City if you try to do a top-down schooling model of doing two, rather doing for and with, and supporting from the soil, from the ground, building from the grassroots up. As a parent, I can tell you how this plays out a little bit in a very real way. As a parent, I myself had a rocky start in K-12 education, never really felt connected to public schools or to schooling, period. I wasn't rooted in it. It wasn't relevant to me. It didn't reflect of everything in my home life that I knew to be true. It was this alien thing that I did. It was this alien place that I went. So in some ways, when I talk about my own personal K-12 experience, I like to say that I did my time as a K-12 student. Definitely did my time as a public school student in 3 different states, in Louisiana, California, and in Minnesota for a period of time. And none of it was good. I hated every bit of it. I was bored to death. I was a terrible student who never really reached my potential. And there were material consequences for that. Once I reached the real world, the world of work and bills, and taxes, and being responsible in life, I saw how many options were shut down to me because I didn't do well in school, because I never really reached my potential and was never really tapped for my talents or for my merit. And then I became a parent in 1990. And at that time, that's when, approximately, 29, 30 years ago, when it really hit me that because of my own K-12 experience, I was now generationally going to pass on a lacking to my own son, to my own firstborn child, who I love. If you are a parent, you know what it is like to love your child, want to give them everything that you possibly can, but also to realize that you are not well positioned to do very much for them. I was somebody who worked for rich people at the time. I was a service industry employee. I was a temporary employee. I worked for people that had money and had resources. I got to see what they were doing for their kids, the type of options they were getting, the type of personalization they were getting for their kids. And I'm looking at my own, knowing that I'm never really going to be able to do that for my kid, or so I thought. That was the tape that was playing in my head. And part of it was because I had never been rooted in education. I'd never been rooted in the schools. I was disconnected from them. And as a parent, I was disconnected from them doubly, as a former student and as a parent. In my own journey as a parent, what I was able to see was that there are going to be other people like me. And I want to just make sure that I always bring their voice into the conversation, not them specifically, but just an element of their voice. What I learned along the way about schools and choice and involvement and race and the homeschool relationship is that relationship, number one, is fractured. That homeschool relationship, for many, it's the parents and the schools very much identify with the culture of the school that they're going to. Definitely white families who have come up through schools that they thought were well performing and have done well, and in some ways were built for them, have a very fond affiliation with those schools when they become parents, and their kids actually maybe do well because of that, but not for many of the rest of us. And that made me an activist who was determined to inform, to agitate, to assist, and to walk beside other parents, especially Black fathers or fathers of color, who might feel the way that I felt back then. One way would be insufficient and insecure about what I know and what I knew. I felt out of place many times walking into the schools, as if those schools were some foreign place that I was walking into that didn't speak my language, and that I wasn't really welcome there, even though my kid was there 6 to 8 hours a day. Angry, oftentimes, about the lack of our culture and our history being accurately reflected in what was being taught there, and having to actively work at home to supplant and supplement what was being taught at school so that we could raise a healthy child who felt good about himself and felt good about his race, his heritage, his background, his parents, and his family. And the schools that I walked into didn't feel as though they belonged to me as a parent. They seemed like they were for someone else and built for someone else. It was like wearing somebody's hand-me-down, someone else's clothes, putting old wine into new wineskin, or vice versa, whatever the analogy is. The thing that we did with the schools, again, they were a formality. We were supposed to do this. At age 5, you're supposed to enroll in school. And oftentimes you're supposed to do the easiest thing, which is enroll your child into the public school that was the closest that you could get into, the closest to your house. So because of that, there were no places that really we felt very connected to as parents. We didn't feel as though we could find the school, like the original point of this discussion when I said, let's imagine you go to a place, you have a concierge, somebody helps you figure out what school is best. We didn't have any of that. We had what many parents had, which was a struggle. And that struggle wasn't just to find a school where the test scores were good, because we would occasionally find a school where test scores for kids like ours were actually good. But then when we would walk through those schools, they too oftentimes felt like they were being done to us rather than with us, and they weren't rooted in our community. So how can we root the schools, and what role can charters play in rooting our schools? This is very basic to me in some ways. I know that probably about 11 months ago, Joe Nathan, who I consider to be one of my mentors, actually stood before you all and talked to you, gave a short talk. And in that, he mentioned a couple of things that I think are important to root in the way that we talk about the history of charting. chartering and the spirit of chartering and some plot points in history that are not the same as what the critics say our chartering idea comes from. So the first one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26. In Article 26 of the Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, it says everyone has a right to a free education. So that's number one. That education should promote the full development of human personality. That's number two. And number three, to me, is the most important one, because till I heard Joe say this, I hadn't actually seen this part of the Declaration. It says that parents should have prior right to choose the kind of education that their children should be given. And that's super important. Is that the basis of the school that you are setting up, that parents have an active voice in choosing the kind of education that their kids are going to get? Joe would also add a couple of things that I will concur with. He will add Kenneth Clark, who had worked with the Brown versus Board team, the team that was working on the case for Brown versus Board. He did the famous Dahl test. And during that case, the biggest thing that they were shooting for was integrated schools. By 1968, Kenneth Clark had changed his mind. He had decided that the elusive dream of integrated schools was not as, number one, it wasn't as realistic. And number two, it wasn't even as valuable as the dream of having schools that were efficient, that could teach kids, and that could teach them in the variety of ways that they needed to be taught. So in 1968, the year that I was born, Kenneth Clark proposed and made a pitch for schools that would be run by other entities other than districts. And those entities included unions, colleges, various different sponsors, very much in the way that charter schools operate today in many states. Joe would also have me tell you about Rosa Parks, who in the last 5 years of her life was attempting to start a homegrown charter school, a charter school that would be grown out of her experience in Detroit and out of her program of working directly with families in Detroit, a homegrown grassroots charter school, and she was denied. I've given those at least two of those examples before in talks that I've had publicly. In one talk, something really interesting happened. I met a person who was an indigenous educator who came to me and said, Chris, you should actually look beyond just the United States and look more globally. And this person gave me a couple of other examples that I thought were really important. One of them is the Zapatista education movement in Mexico. And I don't claim to be an expert on it. I just, I took it to heart to say, what can this teach us about freeing children of color, and specifically kids like mine in the United States, because we are in the middle of a battle. And with that movement in Mexico in 1994, they had an uprising, and out of that uprising came a system of schools that they built for themselves, at least a system of education, and it was called the other education. That's what they actually called the movement. You can look them up. Chiapas Schools has got a lot of information about their movement. But what I gleaned from it as a lesson just from us were some things that they reframed what education should be so that it would meet their needs, their cultural needs within their indigenous peoples. Their teachers were recast as education promoters. Those teachers were elected by the community, supported by the community, even paid and housed and fed by the community, which is something that had happened in Black education years ago with the schools that Booker T. Washington built. 5,000 schools that he built across the American South. Very similar. They elected their teachers, housed them, fed them, and took care of their teachers. In the Zapatista education movement, learning was considered to be an equal exchange between families, students, and the promoters, who were the educators. Communities and the promoters, who were the educators, decided together what kids should learn, how they should be taught, and how they should be evaluated. This sounds to me like very much like you're rooting. You're putting roots into your schools that can't be taken away. And students in those schools don't just learn the things that will help them do well on test scores. As a matter of fact, that's not even one of the main purposes. They learn broadly about education, about land, about work, about food, about culture, independence, freedom, democracy. They learn about peace. This to me sounds like a perfect analog for those of us who spend days thinking about what would a good system look like for people of color, specifically for the children at the margins, to have their own place in the world where they would feel rooted, not just as if they were being put into test prep factories and on the test preparation treadmill. Another example that my Indigenous friend gave me was the Maori people of New Zealand. The Maori people of New Zealand had went through multiple waves of education reform in New Zealand prior to coming to a big aha. Their big aha was, we could keep trying to reform around the fringes and the edges of the mainline education system. But the truth of the matter is that our kids are never going to get a humane education within the colonial context of education, within the colonial schools, within the regular district public schools, the schools that actually had so much to undo, work to undo, that the Maori people just couldn't wait. So what they did was they actually started building rooted schools for their students, schools that were rooted in their language, which was deteriorating at that time, their culture, their history, their legacies, their own ways of doing education, their own practice, their own pedagogy. They built institutional knowledge for themselves around how to teach their own kids. And they started with first grade, they went to second grade, and every year they figured out there really isn't a grade in which our kids are going to be turned back over to the system and they're going to do well with them. So they built a permanent alternative system for their kids from kindergarten all the way through university. Again, a good example, I'm not an expert on it, but a good example for building something to last, something that communities will feel that they own, that is really of them, and that isn't foreign. It isn't like some charter schools drop into a community and it feels like dropping a bad kidney into a body. The body rejects that kidney and kicks it out like a bad organ. And in some ways, we have reformers and charter school people who don't understand that. They say things like, "Oh, I don't understand. We build these great schools and they don't love us for it." We built these schools for them, and they don't appreciate us for the thing that we put into their neighborhood to educate their children without their input, without them being the power that drives it, without them being able to feel completely connected and rooted in what you did. Wow, it's amazing that you don't understand how that failed and how that didn't work. That brings me to a point around big box thinking versus what I consider to be rooted and organic thinking. And this is specific to charter schools. The big box charter school model, to me, runs the risk of educating children in spite of parents rather than with them. The big box model and thinking behind chartering is to create a movement without constituents, where all the knowledge and all the authority is centralized in the hands of very smart people with money, very smart people who know everything about education and don't know why it is, why they fail when they do fail. The big box theory will ask questions like, how do we measure results? How do we define success? The dangerous question, the most dangerous question that they will ask all the time is, how do we scale success? How do we scale this up? And boy, the devil is in the details, because all hell breaks loose when you try to scale a thing that doesn't, one, have a deep foundation in community where it is in the first place, hasn't been informed by the very indigenous people that it is supposedly trying to educate, and has been informed by a top-down model of thinking. Excuse me. By contrast, rooted thinking is a little bit different than that. Rooted thinking asks a different set of questions. What is the purpose of education for each individual? How prepared is each graduate for a personally meaningful and self-determined life? It's a little bit different than charters, achieving test scores. Are you preparing people who will be citizens that can self-determine their life and can lead a personally meaningful life, not one that has been prescribed by someone else about what success means? And a last question I think is one of the most important in education, period, is how do we share? How do we collaborate? How do we build networks instead of scaling? Scaling is the wrong question. A thing that public education has done well for a very long time is scale failure. They have ideas. They put in extreme amounts of money into those ideas. Those ideas are not formed or informed by the people that they are meant to serve. They scale, they go big, and when the implementation is the problem and they break down, they blame the idea. They don't actually blame their constant pursuit of bigger is better, economy of scale. How do we scale this? All of the big box thinking from traditional schools that has, in some ways, if we are fair, found its way into part of the charter sectoring, where how big your network becomes the measure of success, not how well you're preparing people by their own definitions of success in their own communities to live lives within their own communities, in their own cities that they think are meaningful. Independent charters, I think, have an obligation and an opportunity to live up to this original premise that we have in chartering and in alternative education, period, which is number one, to build co-creative schools of choice, to be a source of hope for parents who themselves know what's best for their kids, and they want to make informed choices about matching the needs of their children, the learning needs of their children, to the best matched programs or schools. This will be better to make sure that kids are getting a humane education, that the fit is right, and that their performance probably will be better also because it's been selected with an informed knowledge of the child, like what they need. Charters can build constituencies of responsive educators and responsive schools. And I think it's best if they do it the way that you all are doing your coalition and the schools that you have, without the big box thinking, without the big box McKinsey-esque, how do we scale? What beans do we have to count? But more thinking in terms of what are the roots, the stems, the leaves, what is it you're trying to grow, and growing it organically in the ground. The difference couldn't be more different than getting organically sourced food versus getting big farm processed food. That is the difference that I'm trying to make here when I make a contrast between big box charters and traditional schooling and rooted thinking and organically grown independent charter schools, much like the ones that you all run and operate. And I thank you for. I want to leave a takeaway here. So there's been this talk oftentimes in charter world about we can't just let 1,000 flowers bloom, can we? And that's always rubbed me the wrong way. And I haven't known why, because I think what it's attempting to say is over time, like Monsanto, you refine the chemical process that you need to produce a perfect tomato every single time, rather than having thousands of rows of tomato plants where some of them grow small, some of them grow big, some of them have better taste, and some of them have less flavor, whatever. And the organic process of growing charter schools has always been ripped upon. I live in Minnesota, where we are often not seen as the place where charter schools are held to the big box mentality. They're not held to the big box structures of how you measure success with schools. But we are the home of charter schools. And we are the place where we have a large number of schools that were organically grown out of the communities that they are in, that still survive today in many ways because they have that community connection. They have the connection to the earth, to the soil, to the indigenous people, to the people that they are meant to serve. And I think we are better for that than having our situation be the same as the states where they're under big attack for having a lot of bean counting schools that have these massive networks, but they don't have a constituency. They don't have people that are showing up to the front lines to fight for them when they get in trouble. But if I think back in time to the spirit of where charters came from, there was a lot of activity around site-based management and self-governed schools and middle college, eventually post-secondary enrollment, educational cooperatives, Montessori schools, open schools, schools without walls, project-based learning. That all stemmed out of a time in the 70s when there was upheaval and there was lots of real reflection around what are we going to do for the people that we have left behind for so long? What are we going to do to liberate their schools and liberate the education process so that they can be liberated and so that they can build the communities that they want? There was energy, there was excitement, there was attention to creativity and things that we would do differently. And then we went through a cold age of lots of reforms that narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed what it was that we were focusing on. But then we come to now, we are in the middle of COVID. And once again, we have things like George Floyd and other incidents in the world that are making us rethink our social contract again, making us rethink what it is that we do for people that have been left behind, the people in the shadows in the cities like Minneapolis and elsewhere, the people that are over-policed, the people that are under-resourced, the people that don't live the best lives within some of the cities that have some of the best lifestyles. We are facing once again that same type of energy, that same type of like open question about what do we do to liberate our systems so that they are fairer, so that they are more indigenous, so that they do take care of people more than they harm people. And because we have that energy again, and because of things like COVID, where COVID is making us rediscover ways of learning and teaching at a distance, more parental involvement every day because our kids are at home. Many of them aren't even in schools. Because we have all of these open questions, this could be a time, once again, where we break it all down back to the fine pieces of who are we trying to serve? Who are we trying to educate? What is the measure that they value in terms of what an education is? How will they be prepared for a meaningful life? That is where we're at right now. And I think this is what it takes. It takes, number one, for us getting out of the fog. Reform has been beaten up. Education reform, partially because of things that it should be beaten up for, and ways in which it has behaved where it has earned its criticism. At the same time, I am not here to tell you that the best days of education reform are behind us. I'm not here to tell you that the years of lifting up stories about kids in under-resourced communities is like somehow an old story that we shouldn't tell anymore. I know that we have had some notable failures in things like small schools and teacher evaluation and teacher prep and test-based accountability and national standards and common standards and all of these things. And still, I'm looking through the fog for the signal through the noise, which tells me that we cannot replace hope with nihilism. We cannot have innovation be tamed by parochialism. Those who say that our fight is gone, they're wrong. Those who say that our time has passed, they're wrong. Those who say that we've accomplished too little, they are dead wrong. There are millions of students today that are in rooted schools, in schools that are doing well by them, with a real focus on being rooted in their indigenous communities, into their lives, their heritage, their ancestors, the things that they care about most. That is happening in many places, and we can't let it go by and pretend as though our 150-year fight with the education system somehow is over and we lost. We didn't. We won very specifically because there are people just like you doing the work that you do every day to work in small circumstances to create big, big change in the world. And I appreciate it for one. You know, in The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield's book, he argues that one of the biggest enemies of creativity is a thing that he calls resistance. And resistance is all the ways in which you put off doing the things that you know you need to do, accomplishing the things that you know you need to accomplish. You take on other endeavors, you get lost in the woods, you procrastinate, you actually find all kinds of fancy ways to avoid the thing that you're supposed to be doing. That same idea shows up in other places, like in Napoleon Hill's book, Outwitting the Devil. The devil tells his supposed accuser that he uses schools as an opportunity to take over the minds of kids, to make them drift. So instead of resistance, he calls it drift, to drift from their purpose, to drift from what's most important in life, drift from using their full potential in their brains to think for themselves and to build their own lives. Whether you think it's resistance, whether you think it's drift, I call it the fog. Whatever it is, do the work that you are doing with the clarity of purpose, with the clarity of understanding for why you do it every single day. Use your work as a clarion call for others to see what it is that's important, to get out of the fog, the nihilism. You do the work on the ground every day. There are many of us that just talk about the work that you all do on the ground every day. So all of the nihilism and the blog posts and the Twitter posts and the accusatory kind of things that people say and do to make you feel small about the work that you do, all of it is the fog. It's the noise. It's the resistance. It's the drift. It's the thing that threatens you becoming what it is that you want to be. If we were to go back to the beginning of where I started, I asked you all to imagine a world in which someone knocked at your door and helped you find a school for your kids. The way that I would prefer to end is to say that, excuse me, is to say that imagine a city that you live in, that city that you move to. Your problem isn't just about getting your kids into schools. Imagine that city being a place where every citizen has confessed that every child is born with unsurpassable worth. Imagine that city being a place where every child has parents or guardians who are committed to ruthlessly defending the intellectual development of that child. Imagine that city being a place where every community member has committed themselves to supporting the learning of children in school and out of school. Imagine that being a city where every leader, whether they're elected or appointed or positional, has pledged to be publicly accountable for the outcomes of the children in their jurisdiction. And in every city, imagine that there is an array of schools, a wide variety of schools, where there are learning opportunities for every child, regardless of what it is that they need educationally. That those learning opportunities are rooted deeply in community and in the people, that they are parent-powered, that they are child-centered, and that they are educator-led as a three-legged stool. Imagine that, and I don't want you to wake up from that vision of that dream. I want you to stay in a constant state of believing that the work that you do can make it happen. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you all. I'm excited about the work that you do, and I'm always here to help.